Tonight we walk through a forest where the trees wear their skin on the outside, and you're about to help peel it off. You stand at the edge of the Morna do, the ancient Cork woodlands of Portugal, with a mist rising off the morning grass and the smell of damp earth filling your lungs. The sun hasn't yet burned through the haze, but already you can hear the sound of axes being sharpened, the low murmur of men gathering beneath a massive oak that has stood here since before your great-grandparents were born. You grip the handle of an axe that feels heavier than it should, its blade worn thin from generations of hands exactly like yours, and you realize you have no idea what you're doing. The man beside you, whose face is a map of wrinkles carved by decades of sun and wind, spits on the ground and grunts something in Portuguese that you choose to interpret as encouragement. You're about to learn a trade that has barely changed since the Romans showed up and decided these trees were worth stealing, and you'll spend the next 9 years waiting to find out if you did it right. You probably won't survive the first hour without making a mistake that costs the tree 50 years of recovery, but that's the beauty of working with something that lives longer than you do. Your failures become someone else's problem. The cork oak doesn't look like much at first glance. It's not the tallest tree in the forest, not the most majestic, not the kind of thing you'd paint a landscape around. Its branches twist in awkward directions, its trunk is thick and gnarled, and its bark, well, its bark is what you're here for, and it looks like the tree has been wearing the same wrinkled coat for centuries. Deep furrows run vertically along the trunk, creating a texture that begs to be touched, and when you press your palm against it, you feel something unexpected, give. The bark compresses slightly under your hand, then springs back when you release it, like memory foam invented by nature a million years before humans figured out how to sleep comfortably. This is cork, and it is quite possibly the most useful substance you've never thought about. It floats, it insulates, it seals, it compresses, and it regenerates. Every 9 years, you can strip it off the tree without killing it, and the tree responds by growing another layer, thicker and more valuable than before. The oak has been playing this game with humans for at least 5,000 years, and it's still not entirely clear who domesticated whom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There are no algorithms in the Morna do, no metrics to track, just you and the tree and the slow accumulation of knowledge that comes from doing the same thing your ancestors did, generation after generation. The man beside you, call him Senhor Rui, because that's what everyone calls him, and because he's been doing this since before your parents met, hands you a small axe with a blade that curves inward at the tip. It's not for cutting wood, he explains in broken English mixed with elaborate hand gestures. It's for cutting bark, and there's a difference that will become painfully clear if you get it wrong. The tree bleeds, he says, and he doesn't mean sap. He means the cambium layer, the living tissue just beneath the cork, the part that keeps the oak alive. Damage that, and the tree spends decades sealing the wound, producing low-quality cork that nobody wants to buy. You've essentially given the tree a scar that will show up on every harvest for the rest of its life, which might be another 200 years. No pressure. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The cork oak, or Quercus suber if you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, is a specialist. It grows almost exclusively in the Western Mediterranean, with Portugal and Spain holding the vast majority of the world's cork forests. It likes poor soil, hot summers, and just enough rain to keep from dying. It thrives in conditions that would make most trees give up and become firewood. And it has developed one of the most remarkable survival strategies in the plant kingdom. It grows a thick layer of bark that is technically dead, composed of empty cells filled with air, arranged in a honeycomb structure that scientists still struggle to replicate in laboratories. Each cubic centimeter of cork contains about 40 million cells, and each of those cells is a tiny pocket of air sealed within waterproof walls of suberin, a waxy substance that makes cork impermeable to liquids and gases. The tree uses this bark as insulation against the wildfires that sweep through the Mediterranean every summer. The flames lick up the trunk, blackening the outer layer, but the cork protects the living tissue inside. The tree survives. It adapts. It grows another layer. And then humans showed up and realized that this fire-resistant, waterproof, compressible material might have other uses. The earliest evidence of cork use comes from archaeological sites in Portugal dating back to at least 3000 BCE. Neolithic people using cork for floats on fishing nets, for stoppers in pottery vessels, for the soles of sandals that let them walk across hot ground without blistering their feet. They didn't cultivate the trees. Not yet. They just wandered through the forests, gathering fallen bark and stripping dead branches, taking what the trees offered without giving much thought to the future. It was sustainable by accident, not by design, because there weren't enough people to make a dent in the resource. The cork oaks grew, shed their bark naturally every few years, and regenerated, and the humans took the leftovers and made themselves useful objects. It was a quiet relationship, the kind that develops between species when neither one has any reason to push too hard. But things were about to change. The Romans were coming, and they brought with them a peculiar obsession. They wanted everything sealed. Wine, olive oil, garum, that fermented fish sauce that Roman cuisine apparently couldn't live without. All of it needed containers, and all of those containers needed stoppers. The Romans looked at the cork forests of Iberia and saw not trees but inventory. They didn't invent cork harvesting. The locals had been doing that for millennia, but they industrialized it. They demanded more, faster, better. They built roads through the Morna to move the cork to ports. They established quotas and taxes and regulations. They turned a quiet relationship into an extraction economy, and the trees responded by growing faster, thicker bark, adapting to the pressure of human demand just as they had adapted to the pressure of wildfires. The cork oak, it turns out, is remarkably good at dealing with stress. You run your thumb along the blade of the axe Senhor Rui gave you, feeling the edge that has been sharpened so many times the metal has taken on a concave curve. The handle is smooth from decades of sweat and grip, worn to fit a hand that is not yours, and you wonder how many people have held this same tool, stood in this same spot, felt this same mixture of awe and terror at the task ahead. The sun is beginning to break through the mist now, illuminating the cork trunks with a warm orange light that makes them glow like they're lit from within. Senhor Rui gestures toward the nearest tree and says something that sounds like an instruction, or maybe a warning, or maybe just a comment about the weather. You'll figure it out as you go. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked. You learn by doing, by making mistakes, by watching the men who've been doing it since before you were born, and by listening to the trees themselves. The oaks don't talk, exactly, but they do communicate. They tell you when you're cutting too deep. They tell you when the cork is ready. They tell you when to stop. You just have to learn the language. The cork oak has been watching humans for a very long time, long before anyone thought to write down what they were doing beneath its branches. You stand there in the Morna, axe in hand, and try to imagine what this landscape looked like 5,000 years ago, when the people who walked through these trees had never seen a wheel, never forged a metal tool, never imagined that someday their descendants would be standing here worrying about word counts and YouTube algorithms. They came here because the forest gave them things they needed: shelter, food, materials, and they left behind almost nothing to tell you who they were or what they thought about the trees that surrounded them. A few fragments of pottery, a handful of stone tools, the charcoal remains of ancient fires. And cork. Lots of cork, preserved in the anaerobic layers of riverbeds and coastal settlements, waiting for archaeologists to come along and piece together the story of humanity's longest-running relationship with a tree. The earliest Portuguese cork users weren't harvesters in the way you're about to become. They didn't strip the trees methodically, didn't mark the trunks with harvest years, didn't think about 9-year cycles and sustainable yields. They were foragers, gatherers, scavengers of what the forest naturally shed. Cork oaks, left to their own devices, will eventually slough off their outer bark in thick plates, revealing the smoother, reddish layer beneath. It's a slow process, taking years to complete, but it happens. A tree's way of renewing its protective coat without any human intervention. The Neolithic people of the Iberian Peninsula simply walked through the woods and picked up what they found on the ground, the same way they might collect fallen branches for firewood or wild berries for eating. They took the cork home, shaped it with stone tools, and turned it into objects that made their lives slightly easier. Fishing floats, because cork floats better than almost anything else nature provides. Container stoppers, because cork compresses and expands to form a tight seal. Sandal soles, because cork insulates against heat and cold and provides cushioning for feet that spent all day walking on rocky ground. They didn't invent these applications, they discovered them, through trial and error, through the slow accumulation of knowledge that characterizes most of human history. Historians still argue whether the first deliberate cork harvesting happened by accident or design. You're standing in a forest where that debate plays out every time someone looks at a tree and decides whether to strip it. The argument goes something like this. One camp says that early humans noticed trees with partially detached bark and helped the process along, pulling off loose sections to reveal the smooth bark beneath, and then noticed that those trees eventually grew new cork that was easier to harvest than the original. The other camp says that humans were always more intentional than that they understood from the beginning that stripping a tree doesn't kill it, that they developed techniques for harvesting long before they had the tools to do it efficiently. Both sides have evidence. Both sides have passionate defenders. And both sides are probably wrong, because the truth is almost certainly messier and more complicated than either theory admits. Human relationships with trees don't develop in straight lines. They meander, backtrack, experiment, forget, rediscover. The cork oak and the human have been figuring each other out for millennia, and they're still not done. You bend down and pick up a piece of fallen cork from the base of a tree, turning it over in your hands. It's lighter than you expected, almost feathery, and when you squeeze it, it compresses with a soft crackling sound before springing back to its original shape. This is the stuff that washed up on the shores of ancient settlements, that floated alongside fishing nets in the Tagus River, that plugged the mouths of storage jars in Neolithic kitchens. It's been doing the same things for 5,000 years, and it hasn't changed at all. The people who used it, though, they changed dramatically. They learned to farm, to build permanent settlements, to trade with distant communities. They developed metalworking, first copper, then bronze, then iron. They encountered other cultures, adopted their technologies, adapted them to local conditions. And somewhere along the way, they figured out that cork wasn't just something you found on the ground. It was something you could cultivate, manage, improve. It was a crop, like wheat or olives, only it grew on trees that lived for centuries and required almost nothing from you except patience. The first evidence of deliberate cork harvesting comes from the Iron Age, around 800 BCE, when Celtic tribes moved into the Iberian Peninsula and brought with them iron tools capable of cutting through thick bark without shattering. You're holding one of those tools right now, or at least a descendant of one, the same basic design, the same curved blade, the same purpose. The Celts looked at the cork oaks and saw something the Neolithic people had missed. If you strip the bark carefully, without damaging the living tissue underneath, the tree will grow it back, thicker and more uniform than before. They developed techniques for scoring the bark vertically, for peeling it away in sections, for stacking it to dry. They passed those techniques down through generations, refining them, adapting them to local conditions. By the time the Romans showed up, the people of Iberia had been harvesting cork for centuries, and they'd gotten very good at it. The Romans, being Romans, took one look at this system and decided they could improve it. They brought organization, standardization, scale. They demanded more cork than the local population had ever produced, and they weren't particularly concerned about whether the trees could sustain that level of harvest. They cut deeper, harvested more frequently, pushed the oaks to their limits. And the oaks, being oaks, responded by growing faster. Cork oak is one of those rare species that actually benefits from careful harvesting. The removal of the outer bark stimulates the production of new cork, creating a thicker, more uniform layer than the tree would produce on its own. Within certain limits, the more you harvest, the more the tree gives. The Romans discovered this through pure exploitation, through the pressure of demand, through the kind of relationship that isn't sustainable until it accidentally becomes sustainable. They didn't set out to create a system that would last for millennia. They just wanted more cork, and the trees found a way to provide it. You look at Senhor Rui, who's been watching you examine the fallen cork with an expression that might be amusement or might be impatience. It's hard to tell with someone whose face has been carved by decades of sun and silence. He gestures toward the tree again, then taps his own chest, then points at you. The message is clear enough. The tree has a story, and you're about to become part of it. Every mark on that trunk, every scar and ridge and discoloration, record something that happened in the centuries since it first sprouted from an acorn. Some of those marks come from wildfires, some from storms, some from animals. But most of them come from humans, from people just like you, standing in this same spot with axes in their hands, trying to figure out how to do this without destroying what they've come to love. The tree remembers them all, carries their mistakes and successes in the layers of its bark, and will carry yours too, long after you're gone and forgotten. That's the deal you make when you enter the Morna Dew. You become part of its memory, and it becomes part of yours. The tree you're about to harvest has been waiting 9 years for this moment, and it will wait another 9 for the next one, and another 9 after that, and so on for centuries, outliving every human it ever meets. You walk up to it slowly, the way you might approach a sleeping animal, not wanting to startle something that has every right to be wary of creatures with sharp tools. Senhor Rui stands back and lets you approach alone. This part, you have to figure out for yourself. The oak rises 20 meters into the air, its branches spreading in a canopy that filters the morning light into dappled patterns on the ground below. The trunk at its base is wider than your arms can reach around, and the cork that covers it is deeply furrowed, cracked into geometric patterns that look like they were designed by someone who understood mathematics but preferred chaos. You reach out and touch it again, feeling that familiar give, that slight compression, and you wonder what it's like to be a tree that must be wounded to survive. The biology of Quercus suber is strange enough to seem like a prank played by evolution on anyone who takes trees for granted. Most trees, when you strip their bark, die. The bark is their circulatory system, the pipeline that carries nutrients from leaves to roots and back again. Damage it enough, and the tree starves. But cork oak has developed a workaround. It grows 2 layers of bark, an inner layer of living tissue called the phloem, and an outer layer of dead cells called, well, cork. The cork is pure insulation, protection, armor. It has no living function, no role in the tree's survival beyond shielding the living parts from fire, insects, and temperature extremes. You can strip it all off, right down to the smooth reddish layer beneath, and the tree barely notices. It's like taking off a coat. The tree shivers for a while, adjusts to the sudden exposure, and then sets about growing a new coat, thicker than the last one, better adapted to the conditions that just removed the old one. But here's where it gets weird. The tree has to die to produce cork. Not literally, not permanently, but in a small way, every time. The cork layer is composed of dead cells, filled with air and sealed with suberin, and those cells were once alive. They grew, divided, expanded, and then, at a specific moment in their development, they died. The tree programmed them to die, triggered a controlled cellular suicide that left behind nothing but empty walls and trapped air. It's called programmed cell death, and it happens throughout the natural world. In the formation of your own skin, in the autumn leaves falling from maple trees, in the cork beneath your fingers. The tree kills itself, one cell at a time, to build armor against a world that would otherwise destroy it. And then you come along with an axe and strip that armor away, and the tree kills itself again, building new armor, dying a little more each day so that it can keep living. You're not harvesting cork. You're harvesting the accumulated deaths of millions of cells, the sacrifice the tree makes to survive another season. You step back from the trunk and look up into the canopy, where leaves the size of your hand flutter in a breeze you can't feel at ground level. The tree has been doing this for longer than Portugal has been a country, longer than the Romans occupied Iberia, longer than the Celts brought iron tools to these forests. It sprouted from an acorn sometime around the reign of Afonso Henriques, the first king of Portugal, or maybe earlier, during the Moorish occupation, or maybe even earlier, when Visigoths were still figuring out how to run a kingdom. There's no way to know for sure. Cork oaks don't come with birth certificates, and the people who plant them rarely live to see them harvested. You plant an acorn for your grandchildren's grandchildren, for people you'll never meet, for a future you can't imagine. That's the timeline these trees operate on. 9 years between harvests, yes, but a full century before the first harvest is even possible. A cork oak isn't ready to be stripped until it's at least 25 years old, and the best cork comes from trees that are 50 to 150 years old. You're standing beneath an oak that has been harvested maybe 15 times, each harvest removing a layer of accumulated death, each harvest stimulating new growth, each harvest leaving a mark that will be read by harvesters centuries from now. Historians still argue whether the cork oak evolved its remarkable bark specifically in response to Mediterranean wildfires or whether it was just lucky. The debate gets technical quickly, involving terms like fire regime and adaptive traits and selective pressure. But the basic question is simple. Did the cork oak become what it is because fire repeatedly shaped its evolution, or did it just happen to have traits that proved useful when fire became common? The answer matters because it tells you something about how species adapt to changing conditions, how they respond to pressure, how they survive in worlds that keep trying to kill them. And the answer, as far as anyone can tell, is both. The cork oak's ancestors lived in a landscape that burned regularly, and individuals with thicker, more protective bark survived those fires better than individuals without. Over millions of years, the trait became more pronounced, more refined, more specialized. The tree adapted to fire by learning to die in just the right way, building armor from its own corpses. And then humans showed up with their own fires, their own tools, their own forms of pressure, and the tree adapted to that too. It learned to respond to stripping by growing faster, producing more cork, becoming more valuable to the creatures that kept coming back with axes. It domesticated itself, in a way, or at least entered into a partnership that neither side fully understands. Senhor Rui calls out something you don't catch, and when you turn to look, he's pointing at the trunk, then at his watch, then at the sky. The message is clear enough. Daylight's burning, and you haven't even made your first cut. You walk back to the tree and stand before it, axe in hand, trying to remember everything you've been told about what comes next. The first cut is the most important, the one that sets the pattern for everything that follows. Cut too deep, and you wound the tree, leave a scar that will take decades to heal, produce low-quality cork that nobody will want to buy. Cut too shallow, and you won't penetrate the cork at all, just leave a scratch that will heal over and confuse the next harvester. The cut has to be exactly right, just deep enough to reach the living layer beneath the cork, just shallow enough to stop before damaging it. Generations of harvesters have developed techniques for judging this depth by feel, by sound, by the resistance of the blade. You don't have generations of experience. You have Senhor Rui watching from 20 meters away, ready to yell at you if you get it wrong, and you have the tree itself, waiting to show you what it's capable of. The men who harvest cork are called descorticadores, and they do not consider themselves farmers or foresters or manual laborists. They are something else entirely, something closer to physicians or priests, intermediaries between the human world and the world of the trees. You learn this gradually as you stand there with your axe, watching Senhor Rui approach the oak with a kind of reverence you didn't expect from someone who spends his days stripping bark for a living. He places his palm flat against the trunk, closes his eyes for a moment, and murmurs something too quiet for you to hear. Then he steps back, nods at you, and gestures for you to begin. The tree has been acknowledged. The conversation can start. Every discorticator inherits his trees, and his trees inherit him. The relationship isn't about ownership in the legal sense. The land may belong to some distant nobleman or corporation or government, but about something deeper, something closer to kinship. Senhor Rui has been harvesting these particular oaks for 43 years, since he was a boy of 12, learning from his father who learned from his father before him. He knows each tree individually, knows which ones produce thick cork and which ones produce thin, which ones heal quickly and which ones hold grudges, which ones can be harvested early and which ones need extra time. He has names for some of them, not official names that appear on any map, but private names that he uses when he talks to them, which he does regularly. The trees talk back, he insists, not in words but in the way their bark peels, in the resistance they offer to the blade, in the color of the newly exposed trunk. You have to listen, he says. You have to pay attention. The trees will tell you everything you need to know if you're quiet enough to hear. You're not sure you believe him, but you're also not sure you don't. There's something about the Mornadu that makes skepticism feel like a failure of imagination, like insisting the ocean is just water while standing on a beach at sunset. The light filters through the canopy in shafts that seem almost solid, illuminating patches of grass and wildflowers with a clarity that makes them look hyperreal. The air smells of eucalyptus and cork dust and something else, something ancient and earthy that you can't identify. And the trees themselves, they do seem to watch you, to follow your movements with an attention that feels almost sentient. It's probably just the way their branches cast shadows, the way the light plays tricks on your peripheral vision. Probably. But you find yourself glancing over your shoulder as you approach the oak, half expecting it to say something, and when it doesn't, you're not sure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. The Guild of Discorticadores isn't a formal organization with membership cards and annual dues. It's more like a lineage, a chain of knowledge passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, stretching back to before anyone thought to write down how it all began. The skills are taught in the field, not in classrooms, through demonstration and correction and endless repetition. You learn by watching, by doing, by making mistakes and having them pointed out with varying degrees of patience. You learn which trees to approach from which side, how to read the grain of the cork, when to push harder and when to ease off. You learn that the best harvest happens in summer, when the cork is loose and the tree is dormant, and that harvesting in winter can damage the cambium layer beyond repair. You learn that rain is your enemy, that wet cork is heavy cork, that heavy cork is hard to transport and prone to mold. You learn 1,000 small things that add up to a trade, and by the time you've learned them all, you're old enough to start teaching someone else. Senhor Rui learned from his father, who learned from his father, who learned from his father, and so on back through the generations until the line disappears into the fog of history. The family has been harvesting cork in this region for at least 300 years, possibly longer. The records are spotty, and the trees don't keep track of human lineages. They've seen wars and plagues and political upheavals, watched empires rise and fall, witnessed the transformation of Portugal from a medieval kingdom to a global power to a modern democracy. Through it all, they've kept coming back to the Mornadu, year after year, generation after generation, doing the same work in the same way, connected to their ancestors by nothing more than a shared relationship with a species of tree that outlives them all. You wonder what it would feel like to have that kind of continuity, that deeper root in a particular place and practice. You wonder if it feels like freedom or like imprisonment, like purpose or like obligation. You suspect it feels like all of those things at once, like most things that matter. Historians still argue whether the Discorticadores should be considered a distinct cultural group or just workers with a specialized skill. The debate turns on questions of identity, tradition, and self-definition. Do the harvesters see themselves as different from other rural laborists, as bearers of a unique heritage that deserves recognition and protection? Or do they just see themselves as people doing a job, the same job their parents did, without any particular sense of mission or meaning? The answer, as you might expect, varies from person to person and family to family. Some descorticadores take fierce pride in their work, seeing it as a calling, a connection to something larger than themselves. Others treat it as just another way to make a living, no different from farming or fishing or working in a factory. Senhor Rui falls somewhere in between. He doesn't talk about his work in grand terms, doesn't make speeches about tradition and heritage. But when he puts his hand on a tree and closes his eyes, you can see that something passes between them, something that matters, something that can't be reduced to economics or labor relations. You raise your axe and position it against the trunk, trying to remember the angle Senhor Rui showed you, the depth he recommended, the rhythm he demonstrated. The blade rests against the cork, and you can feel the tree breathing beneath it, or at least you imagine you can, which amounts to the same thing. Senhor Rui stands a few meters away, watching but not interfering, letting you find your own way into this relationship. The morning sun has burned off most of the mist now, and the morning dew is coming alive with birds and insects and the distant sound of other harvesters working other trees. You take a breath, steady your hands, and prepare to make the first cut. The tree waits. The blade waits. The centuries of tradition behind you wait. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you hear Senhor Rui's voice, not speaking aloud but echoing from the demonstration earlier. The tree will tell you what to do. Just listen. The geometry of cork extraction is not something you learned in school, not something you could have learned anywhere except here, standing in front of a tree with an axe in your hand and an old man watching your every move. You position the blade against the cork at a specific angle, about 30 degrees, Senhor Rui demonstrated, though you're not entirely sure you've got it right, and you prepare to make the first vertical cut. This is the most critical moment of the entire harvest, the cut that determines everything that follows. Get it right, and the rest of the process flows naturally, the cork peeling away in satisfying sections. Get it wrong, and you'll spend hours fighting the tree, making ragged cuts that damage the bark and compromise the next harvest. No pressure. The vertical cut, or abra as the harvesters call it, runs the full height of the harvestable section of trunk, from just above the ground to the point where the branches begin to emerge. You have to judge the depth perfectly, deep enough to slice through the cork entirely, shallow enough to stop before reaching the living cambium beneath. The blade should feel the transition, the sudden change in resistance when it moves from dead cork to living tissue, and you have to stop at exactly that moment. Too shallow, and you'll have to cut again, leaving a ragged edge that will heal poorly. Too deep, and you'll score the cambium, creating a wound that will take decades to seal and will permanently mark every future harvest from this tree. The tree bleeds, Senhor Rui said, and he wasn't exaggerating. Damage the cambium, and the tree will lose a dark, sticky fluid that stains the cork and attracts insects and fungi. The wound will never fully heal. 50 years from now, harvesters will still be working around the scar you left, cursing your name even though they'll never know it. You take a breath and swing the axe in a smooth arc, bringing the blade down against the cork with a sound that's somewhere between a thud and a slice. The blade bites into the bark, and you feel it immediately, the resistance, the give, the subtle change as it penetrates deeper. You're supposed to stop at exactly the right moment, but you don't, not quite, and the blade digs a fraction of an inch too deep before you can arrest its motion. You freeze, waiting for Senhor Rui to yell at you, but he just watches, expressionless, and you realize he's waiting to see what you'll do next. The tree, for its part, doesn't react visibly. There's no blood, no obvious damage, just a slightly deeper cut than you intended. Maybe it's okay. Maybe the cambium is still intact, protected by some microscopic layer of cells you didn't quite reach. Maybe you got lucky. You'll find out in 9 years, when the next harvester comes to strip this tree and sees how the wound healed. That's the timeline you're working with. Your mistakes become someone else's problems, and your successes become someone else's foundation. The vertical cut complete. You move to the horizontal ones. These define the top and bottom of the section you'll harvest, creating clean edges that will help the cork peel away in manageable pieces. The top cut goes just below the first branches, where the cork begins to thin out and lose quality. The bottom cut goes just above the ground, where dirt and debris might otherwise contaminate the harvest. Between these boundaries, you'll make additional vertical cuts, spacing them about 1 meter apart, dividing the trunk into panels that you can remove one by one. Each panel is roughly the size of a small door, thick and heavy and surprisingly warm to the touch, as if the tree has been storing heat against the coming cool of the evening. Senhor Rui moves closer now, watching your technique with the critical eye of someone who's been doing this since before you were born. He doesn't say anything, but you can feel his attention like a weight on your shoulders, a reminder that you're being evaluated against standards you don't fully understand. The descorticadores have their own way of measuring success, their own criteria for judging a harvest, and those criteria have nothing to do with speed or quantity or any of the metrics you're used to from the modern world. They care about cleanliness, about precision, about the long-term health of the tree. A good harvest leaves the tree looking like it's been shaved, not butchered, smooth and uniform and ready to begin the slow process of growing new armor. A bad harvest leaves scars, ragged edges, patches of cork left behind that will interfere with future growth. Your harvest is shaping up to be somewhere in between, and you're not sure whether to be proud or ashamed. Historians still argue whether the traditional harvesting techniques developed independently in different regions or spread through trade and contact. The basic geometry of cork extraction, vertical cuts, horizontal boundaries, panel by panel removal, appears in every cork-producing region around the Mediterranean, from Portugal to Morocco to Sardinia. But the details vary: the spacing between cuts, the angle of the blade, the tools used, the rituals observed. Some regions use axes like the one you're holding. Others prefer specialized knives with curved blades. Some harvest in spring, others in summer. Some leave the stripped trees bare for months before the new bark begins to form. Others treat the exposed surface with various concoctions to promote healing. The variations are endless, and they reflect local conditions, local traditions, local relationships between people and trees. There's no single right way to harvest cork, just as there's no single right way to be human. You find what works and you stick with it, passing it down through generations until it feels like the only possible way. You move to the next vertical cut, this time more confident, more in control. The blade bites into the cork, and you feel the transition, the subtle change in resistance, and you stop exactly where you should. Perfect. Senhor Rui nods almost imperceptibly, and you feel a surge of satisfaction out of all proportion to the achievement. You've made one good cut. There will be hundreds more before this tree is fully harvested, thousands before this season ends, millions in a lifetime of work. But this one cut, this tiny moment of precision, connects you to every descorticator who ever stood in this forest and felt the same satisfaction, the same sense of having done something exactly right. The tree, for its part, doesn't acknowledge your success. It just stands there, waiting for the next cut, the next panel, the next stage in a relationship that will outlast you both. The sound comes first, before any visual cue, before you even realize what's happening. You've made your cuts, defined your panels, and now it's time to remove the cork from the tree. Senhor Rui shows you how to insert the wedge-shaped end of your axe handle into the vertical cut, twisting it gently to create separation between the cork and the trunk. And then you hear it, a sound like tearing fabric, but deeper, wetter, more organic. The cork begins to pull away from the tree, and the sound fills the air around you. A slow ripping that seems to go on forever even though the actual separation takes only seconds. It's the sound of a tree undressing, of armor being removed, of death being harvested so that life can continue. You've never heard anything quite like it, and you suspect you'll never forget it. The descorticadores listen more than they look. Senhor Rui told you this earlier, and now you understand why. Your eyes can tell you when the cork is separating, can show you the gap widening between bark and trunk, but your ears tell you how it's separating, whether it's coming cleanly or tearing, whether the tree is releasing its armor willingly or fighting to hold on. A clean peel produces a continuous ripping sound, steady and even, like a long seam being opened. A bad peel produces stutters and stops, sharp cracks as the cork breaks instead of separates, a rhythm of resistance that tells you something's wrong. You learn to read these sounds, to adjust your technique based on what you hear, to work with the tree instead of against it. The tree talks, Senhor Rui said. You just have to listen. You're listening now, straining to interpret the sounds coming from your first panel. The cork is about 5 centimeters thick at this point, dense and heavy, and as you work the wedge deeper, you hear that beautiful ripping sound, steady and continuous, and you know you've done something right. The panel begins to bow outward, separating from the trunk along a clean line that follows the grain of the cork. You can see the newly exposed surface beneath, smooth, reddish-brown, almost glowing in the morning light. It's the tree's living skin, the cambium layer that has been protected by cork for the last 9 years, and now it's exposed to air and light for the first time since the last harvest. It looks vulnerable, almost raw, and you feel a sudden protectiveness toward it, an urge to cover it back up even though you know that's not how this works. The tree will heal. The tree will grow new armor. The tree will be fine. But right now, in this moment, it looks like it needs you to be gentle. The panel comes free with a final, satisfying rip, and you're holding a piece of cork the size of a small door, heavy and warm and slightly damp on the side that was against the tree. You turn it over in your hands, feeling its weight, its texture, its impossible lightness despite its size. This piece of bark, this accumulation of dead cells and trapped air, will eventually become something useful, a wine stopper, a bulletin board, a floor tile, 100 other things you can't imagine right now. But first it has to be processed, dried, sorted, graded. First it has to spend months in a yard, stacked with other panels, slowly losing moisture and gaining stability. First it has to forget it was ever part of a tree. You set it carefully on the ground, the way you might set down a sleeping child, and turn back to the tree for the next panel. Senhor Rui is working his own tree a few meters away, and you can hear the rhythm of his harvest even when you can't see it. The sounds are different from yours, smoother, more efficient, less hesitant. He's been doing this so long that his body knows what to do without consulting his mind, his hands finding the right angles and pressures automatically, his ears interpreting sound you can't even hear. You listen to him the way you might listen to a master musician, trying to understand the patterns, the variations, the subtle differences that separate proficiency from mastery. You'll never sound like that, not in a single season, not in a decade. But you can learn to hear the difference, to recognize what you're aiming for, to measure your progress against a standard that exists only in the sounds of the forest. Historians still argue whether the traditional harvesting techniques produce better cork or just different cork. The debate is surprisingly heated, given that it's about something as mundane as tree bark. Proponents of traditional methods argue that hand-harvested cork is superior because the harvesters can feel the tree's response, can adjust their technique in real time, can avoid damaging the cambium in ways that mechanical harvesters cannot. Skeptics counter that modern methods are more consistent, more efficient, and produce cork that is perfectly adequate for most purposes. Both sides have evidence. Both sides have passionate defenders. And both sides are probably right, depending on what you mean by better. If you care about tradition, about connection, about the relationship between human and tree, then hand-harvested cork is the only choice. If you care about cost, about scale, about meeting global demand, then mechanical harvesting makes more sense. The cork itself doesn't care either way. It's just dead cells, waiting to be useful. You move to the next panel, inserting your wedge, feeling the resistance, listening for the sound. This one comes less cleanly than the first, stuttering in places, making sharp cracking sounds that make you wince. You're doing something wrong, or the tree is doing something different, or both. You adjust your angle, ease off the pressure, try again. The sound smooths out, becomes more regular, and the panel begins to separate. You're learning, slowly, by making mistakes and correcting them, by listening and adjusting, by paying attention to what the tree is telling you. It's not efficient. It's not scalable. It's not the kind of learning you could package into a manual or a training video. But it's the only kind that works here, in the morna do, between you and the tree. You learn by doing, by failing, by trying again. You learn by listening. The moment the last panel falls away, you step back and see the tree for the first time. Not the tree you approached this morning, wrapped in its armor of deep furrowed cork, but something else entirely, a creature stripped naked, revealed in a form you couldn't have imagined. The trunk beneath the cork is smooth, almost polished, the color of cinnamon or old leather or the inside of a river stone. It glows in the afternoon light with a warmth that seems to come from within, as if the tree has been keeping a secret all these years and has finally decided to show you. You stand there, breathing hard from the effort of the harvest, and you can't look away. The tree is beautiful. Not in the way you usually think of trees as beautiful, majestic, ancient, picturesque, but in a way that feels intimate, almost indecent. You've seen something you weren't supposed to see. You've uncovered something that was meant to stay hidden. The descorticadores call this momento do descorticamento, the moment of stripping, and they treat it with a reverence that borders on religious. Senhor Rui has stopped his own work and come to stand beside you, and together you contemplate the naked tree in silence. This is not a moment for words, not a moment for analysis or instruction. This is a moment for witness, for acknowledgement, for the simple act of being present while a living thing undergoes a transformation that it will survive but never forget. The tree will carry this moment in its rings, in the pattern of its future growth, in the way its new cork forms around the memory of exposure. And you will carry it too, in ways you don't yet understand. The newly exposed trunk is not uniform. You realize as you look closer. It bears the marks of previous harvests, faint lines where the cork was cut decades ago, subtle variations in color and texture that record the tree's history like rings on a fingerprint. Some of these marks are straight and clean, evidence of skilled harvesters who knew exactly what they were doing. Others are ragged and uneven, scars from cuts that went too deep, from mistakes made by someone long dead. The tree remembers them all, carries them forward through time, incorporates them into its ongoing story. You search for the mark you made this morning, the cut that went slightly too deep, and you find it, a thin line, barely visible, but there. The tree will remember you too, will carry your mistake forward through decades of growth, will show it to every harvester who comes after. You've become part of its history, whether you wanted to or not. The transformation from armored giant to naked being happens in stages, and you only now realize that you've been watching it unfold all day. The first panels revealed small patches of the inner trunk, glimpses of what lay beneath, teasers of the revelation to come. With each panel removed, more of the tree was exposed, until finally the last piece fell away and the full truth stood before you. It's like watching someone remove a mask, layer by layer, until the face beneath is finally visible. And like any such revelation, it raises questions you didn't know you had. Who is this tree, really? What does it look like when no one is watching? How much of what you thought you knew was just the armor, the protection, the public face? Historians still argue whether the ancient peoples who first harvested cork understood the tree's biology or just stumbled into a working relationship through trial and error. The question matters because it gets at something fundamental about how humans learn, how we accumulate knowledge, how we develop technologies without understanding the principles behind them. Did the Neolithic cork users know that stripping the bark stimulates new growth? Or did they just notice that trees they'd stripped seemed to produce more cork over time? Did they understand the role of the cambium layer? Or did they just learn through bitter experience that cutting too deep kills the tree? The evidence suggests a mix of both, some understanding, some trial and error, some knowledge passed down without explanation. The descorticadores today don't need to understand the cellular biology of cork production to be effective harvesters. They just need to know what works, what doesn't, and how to tell the difference. The knowledge is in their hands, not in their heads. You reach out and touch the naked trunk, and the sensation is completely different from this morning. The cork was rough, textured, giving slightly under pressure. The inner bark is smooth, almost slick, and it's warm from the afternoon sun in a way that feels alive. You can feel the tree's pulse, or at least you imagine you can, the slow movement of sap, the quiet respiration of a being that operates on a timescale you can barely comprehend. The tree doesn't flinch at your touch, doesn't react at all, but you feel a connection that wasn't there before, a sense of having been let in on a secret. You know what this tree looks like naked. You've seen it at its most vulnerable. That means something, even if you can't quite articulate what. Senhor Rui breaks the silence at last, speaking in his rough Portuguese that you're slowly learning to understand. He's not saying anything profound, just commenting on the quality of the harvest, the thickness of the cork, the health of the tree. But his voice is softer than usual, gentler, as if he's also been affected by the transformation you've witnessed. He runs his own hand over the naked trunk, nodding approvingly at something you can't see, and then he turns away and walks back to his own tree, leaving you alone with yours. The afternoon stretches ahead, full of more work, more panels, more trees. But this moment of revelation, of nakedness, of connection, will stay with you. The tree will grow new armor, will hide itself away again, will become once more the gnarled, textured being you approached this morning. But you'll know what lies beneath. You'll know the truth. Before you leave the tree, before you move on to the next one, before the day's work is done and you return to whatever evening awaits you, there is one more task. Senhor Rui hands you a small knife, different from the axe you've been using, shorter, sharper, more precise. He points to the naked trunk, to a spot about chest high, and makes a cutting motion with his hand. You look at him questioningly, and he says one word, "Ano." Yeah. You're about to mark the tree. The tradition goes back centuries, probably millennia, though no one knows exactly when it started. After the harvest is complete, after the cork is removed and stacked and the tree stands bare in the afternoon light, the harvester carves the last digit of the year into the trunk. Not the full year, just the final number, a single digit that will tell future harvesters when this tree was last stripped. You look at the trunk and see the marks of previous harvests, a vertical line of numbers climbing the tree like a timeline carved in bark. Each digit representing a year, a harvest, a moment in the tree's long conversation with humans. The oldest mark you can see is a faint 7, nearly grown over, from a harvest decades ago. The most recent is a crisp 4, from 9 years past, the last time someone stood here with a knife and carved the date into this trunk. Now it's your turn to add to the sequence. You position the knife against the smooth bark, just below the 4, and you pause. This mark will outlast you. It will be visible for decades, maybe centuries, gradually fading as the tree grows and heals but never completely disappearing. Long after you're gone, long after Senhor Rui is gone, long after everyone you know is dead and forgotten, some future harvester will stand here and see your mark, will know that in this year, in this spot, someone did this work. They won't know your name, won't know anything about you except that you were here and you did your job and you left your mark on the tree. It's not immortality. Exactly. It's something smaller and stranger, a connection across time, a thread linking you to people you'll never meet, a a reminder that the work continues whether you're there to do it or not. You carve the digit carefully, pressing just deep enough to mark the bark without damaging the living tissue beneath. The number 5 takes shape under your knife, joining the sequence, becoming part of the tree's history. You step back and look at it, this small addition to a record that spans generations. The tree now bears the marks of at least 15 harvests, 15 moments when someone stood here and did exactly what you're doing. That means this tree has been providing cork for at least 135 years, probably longer. The earliest marks may have grown over completely, lost to time and healing. It was already old when the first mark was carved, already mature, already producing the cork that made it valuable. It has outlasted every harvester who ever touched it, and it will outlast you too, will keep growing and producing and receiving marks long after your mark has faded to near invisibility. The numbering system varies from region to region, family to family. Some use the full year, carving 4 digits into the bark. Others use Roman numerals, or symbols that only they understand. Some mark not just the year but the harvester's initial, or a symbol representing their family, or a code that indicates the quality of the harvest. The trunk becomes a record, a document, a message to the future. It tells the next harvester when to return, how long to wait, what to expect. It also tells them something about the people who came before, their literacy, their priorities, their relationship with the tree. A trunk covered in careful, consistent marks suggests a family of careful, consistent harvesters. A trunk with gaps and variations suggests disruption, change, the breaking of tradition. Your mark is now part of that story, for better or worse. Historians still argue whether the practice of marking harvest years originated as a practical record-keeping tool or as something more ritualistic. The practical explanation is obvious. You need to know when a tree was last harvested so you don't come back too soon and damage it by stripping immature cork. But the marks are often placed where they're difficult to read, or they use systems that are unnecessarily complex, or they include elements that have no practical function. Some researchers see evidence of ritual in these marks, offerings to tree spirits, records of important events, ways of claiming connection to particular trees. Others dismiss this as romantic fantasy, insisting that everything about the marks can be explained by practical necessity. The debate will probably never be settled, because the people who made the marks are long dead and can't tell you what they were thinking. All you have is the marks themselves, and what you make of them depends on what you bring to the encounter. You run your finger over the fresh cut, feeling the slight roughness where your knife disturbed the smooth bark. The number 5 stands out clearly against the reddish background, a pale scar that will darken over time but never quite disappear. In 9 years, someone will come to this tree and see your mark, will know that the cork is ready, will add their own mark below yours. The sequence will continue, year after year, harvest after harvest, as long as the tree lives and the tradition endures. You wonder who that someone will be, what their life will be like, whether they'll think about you as they add their mark to the trunk. Probably not. They'll be focused on their own work, their own trees, their own marks. But maybe, just maybe, they'll pause for a moment and wonder about the person who carved that 5, so many years ago. Maybe they'll feel the same connection you're feeling now, looking at the marks left by people you'll never know. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the whole point. 9 years pass. Not for you, not really. You're still standing in the morna dew, still holding your axe, still watching Senhor Rui work his trees. But in the world of the cork oak, 9 years is just another interval, another cycle, another waiting period between harvests. The tree you stripped this morning will stand here for 9 years, growing new cork, healing its wounds, preparing for the next time someone comes with an axe and a knife and the patience to do this work. And when that time comes, you might be there, or you might not. The tree doesn't care either way. It will keep growing, keep producing, keep playing its part in a relationship that predates your existence and will outlast it. But for now, You have to imagine what those 9 years look like from the tree's perspective. You have to slow down your human sense of time, your need for immediate results and constant feedback, and try to inhabit a different rhythm entirely. The tree doesn't rush. It doesn't check its watch or worry about deadlines or calculate how many years it has left. It just grows, day by day, season by season, adding microscopic layers of cells that will eventually become the cork you harvest. In the first year after stripping, the new cork is thin and fragile, barely more than a skin protecting the exposed cambium. In the second year, it thickens slightly, gaining strength and density. By the 5th year, it's recognizable as cork, though still too thin to harvest. By the 9th year, it's reached the minimum thickness for another stripping, about 2 to 3 centimeters, depending on the tree and the conditions. And then it waits, because the harvesters might come this year or next, and the tree has no way of knowing which. The new cork grows from the inside out, pushed outward by the living cells of the cambium layer. Each year adds a new ring, visible under a microscope but invisible to the naked eye, recording the conditions of that particular growing season. Wet years produce wider rings, dry years produce narrower ones, fire years produce scars and disruptions. By the time the cork is ready for harvest, it contains 9 years of history, 9 years of weather and climate and the tree's response to both. You're not just harvesting bark. You're harvesting time, compressed and preserved in the cells of a tree that has learned to turn adversity into armor. While you've been imagining the tree's 9 years, the tree has been living them. It has felt the sun on its exposed trunk, the first time in nearly a decade that its living skin has been directly touched by light. It has adjusted to this new reality, thickening its outer cells to provide some protection, developing a slightly different texture than the previous layer. It has weathered storms and droughts, insect attacks, and fungal invasions, using its newly grown cork as a shield against all of them. It has dropped its acorns each autumn, feeding the wild pigs that roam the Mornadu, contributing to the next generation of cork oaks that will replace it when it finally dies. It has done all the things trees do, on the timescale trees do them, without any awareness that humans are waiting for it to be ready again. And now you're back. Not literally, you're still in the same day, the same harvest, the same moment when the tree stands naked before you. But in your imagination, 9 years have passed, and you're returning to this tree to see what it's become. You walk through the Mornadu, noting the changes, new growth, fallen branches, the shifting patterns of light and shadow. You find your tree, and at first you barely recognize it. The naked cinnamon trunk is gone, replaced by a new layer of cork, rough and furrowed and deeply textured. The tree has put its armor back on, has hidden itself away again, has become once more the gnarled, ancient-looking being you first approached. But you know what lies beneath. You remember. And when you look closely, you can see the marks of previous harvests, including your own, the faint 5 you carved 9 years ago, now partially grown over but still visible, still part of the tree's story. Historians still argue whether cork oaks experience stress from harvesting or simply respond to it as a natural part of their life cycle. The question matters for conservation, for management, for understanding how best to treat these trees that have become so important to human economies. Some researchers point to studies showing that harvested trees produce more cork than unharvested ones, suggesting that stripping is beneficial, that the tree has evolved to expect and respond to this kind of disturbance. Others note that harvested trees sometimes show signs of stress, reduced acorn production, increased susceptibility to disease, shorter lifespans, indicating that stripping takes a toll even if the tree survives it. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. The cork oak has adapted to harvesting over millennia, has developed mechanisms for responding to it, has incorporated it into its life cycle. But adaptation isn't the same as preference. The tree would probably rather be left alone, if it had preferences. It doesn't. It just grows, and responds, and survives, and dies, and makes way for the next generation. You place your hand on the new cork, feeling its texture, its give, its warmth. 9 years of growth, 9 years of protection, 9 years of waiting. The tree is ready again, ready to be stripped, ready to reveal itself once more. And you're ready too, in your human way, ready to do the work, to make the cuts, to witness the transformation. The cycle continues. The relationship endures. The tree grows, and you harvest, and the world keeps turning. And somewhere in the future, someone you'll never meet will stand here and do it all over again. That's the deal. That's the promise. That's the quiet process of harvesting cork in ancient Portugal. And it will continue as long as there are trees and people and the patience to wait 9 years between meetings. The cork lies on the ground where you left it, panels stacked haphazardly while you moved on to other trees. Now comes the part of the harvest that requires no axe, no knife, no cutting at all. Just patience and attention and the willingness to let time do its work. You look at the pile of cork, at the dozens of panels you've stripped from a handful of trees, and you realize you have no idea what comes next. Senhor Rui sees your confusion and gestures toward a clearing in the distance, where you can see other stacks, other piles, other harvesters arranging their bounty in patterns that look random but clearly aren't. The stacking of cork is an art form, or at least a craft with its own rules and traditions. You can't just throw the panels in a pile and hope for the best. They have to be arranged carefully, with space between them for air to circulate, with the curved outer sides facing up to shed rain, with the flat inner sides exposed to the drying effects of sun and wind. The stacks have to be stable enough to withstand storms, accessible enough for inspection, organized enough to keep track of which cork came from which tree and which harvest. And they have to be placed in specific locations, not too shady, not too exposed, not too close to trees that might drop debris, not too far from the path that will eventually carry the cork to market. You follow Senhor Rui to the clearing, where a series of stacks rise in neat rows, each about waist high and several meters long. The panels are arranged in a pattern that reminds you of masonry, each layer offset from the one below to create stability and airflow. Some of the stacks are fresh, the cork still damp from the tree, still oozing the dark fluid that seeps from freshly cut surfaces. Others are older, the cork faded to a silvery grey, the surfaces cracked and weathered from months of exposure. Senhor Rui points to an empty space at the end of a row and gestures for you to start stacking your panels there. You're about to learn that the work isn't over just because the trees are stripped. The first rule of stacking, you discover, is that cork breathes. It's full of air, 40 million cells per cubic centimeter, and those cells need to exchange that air with the atmosphere or the cork will rot. That's why the stacks have to be spaced just right, too tight, and the moisture gets trapped, leading to mold and decay. Too loose, and the stacks become unstable, panels sliding and falling, getting damaged in ways that reduce their value. You have to find the sweet spot, the balance between stability and airflow, and maintain it across hundreds of panels stacked over weeks of harvesting. It's like building with living materials, because in a sense you are. The cork may be dead, but it's still responding to its environment, still changing, still becoming something new. You pick up your first panel and examine it closely for the first time since you removed it from the tree. The outer surface is rough and deeply furrowed, the same texture you touched this morning when you first approached the oak. The inner surface is smoother, almost velvety, with faint ridges where the cork was in contact with the cambium. Between them, the cross-section reveals layer after layer of growth, each representing a year of the tree's life, each recording the conditions of that particular season. You can see dark lines where growth slowed, lighter bands where it accelerated, tiny imperfections where insects or fungi tried to penetrate and failed. This panel contains 9 years of history, compressed into a thickness you can span with your hand. And now you have to stack it with dozens of others, creating a structure that will preserve that history until the cork is ready for its next life. Historians still argue whether the traditional stacking methods developed independently or spread through trade routes and cultural contact. The basic principles: stacking with space for airflow, orienting panels to shed rain, arranging them in stable patterns, appear in cork-producing regions throughout the Mediterranean, but the details vary widely. Some regions stack their cork in pyramids, others in long rows, others in circular piles that resemble miniature buildings. Some cover their stacks with additional layers of cork to protect them from the elements. Others leave them exposed to the full force of sun and wind. Some sort their cork by quality during stacking, others wait until later. The variations reflect local conditions, local traditions, local preferences, and they all work, more or less, because cork is forgiving stuff that wants to dry properly and will do so under a wide range of conditions. You place your first panel on the ground, following Senhor Rui's gestures to position it just so. Then another on top, offset slightly so the edges don't align. Then another, and another, building a small tower of cork that grows steadily as you work. The panels are heavy, each one requiring both hands to lift and position, and you quickly work up a sweat despite the cooling afternoon air. But there's something satisfying about this part of the process, something almost meditative. You're not cutting, not risking damage to living trees, not worrying about depth and angle and precision. You're just stacking, building, creating order out of chaos. The cork that was part of a tree this morning is now part of a structure, a temporary building that will stand here for months, slowly drying and aging, preparing for its journey to wherever it's going next. The sun begins to sink toward the horizon, lengthening the shadows across the clearing, and you realize you've been stacking for hours without noticing the passage of time. Your pile has grown into a respectable stack, waist-high and stable, containing the harvest from perhaps a dozen trees. Senhor Rui's pile beside yours is twice as tall, twice as neat, the panels arranged with a precision you can only admire. He works without seeming to think about it, his hands knowing exactly where each panel belongs, his eyes judging the stability of the stack with glances that take in the whole structure at once. You'll never be that good, not in a single season, not in a decade. But you're learning, slowly, by watching and doing and making mistakes that Senhor Rui corrects with grunts and gestures. By the time this harvest is over, you might even be competent. By the time the next harvest comes, 9 years from now, you might be ready to teach someone else. The cork has been stacked for months now, slowly drying in the Portuguese sun, slowly transforming from something that was part of a tree into something that might become part of a wine bottle or a floor or a bulletin board. You've returned to the Mornadu after a long absence, weeks, maybe months. Time moves differently when you're waiting for cork to cure, and you find your stack still standing, still stable, still holding the panels you arranged so carefully. But they look different now. The rich reddish-brown of fresh cork has faded to a silvery grey, the surface is cracked and weathered, the edges slightly curled from the drying process. The cork has been sleeping, dreaming its slow dreams of air and light, and now it's time to wake it up. The boiling happens in a place you haven't seen before, a clearing near the edge of the forest where great black cauldrons sit over wood fires, tended by men who have been doing this work for decades. The cauldrons are ancient things, their iron sides blackened by countless fires, their rounded bottoms worn thin by decades of use. They look like they belong in a museum, or in a fairy tale about witches and potions and magical transformations. But they're real, and they're essential, and without them the cork you've harvested would be nearly useless. You watch as workers load panels into the cauldrons, submerging them in water that's been heated to just below boiling, and you wonder what's happening inside that dark, bubbling liquid. The boiling is not about sterilization, though it does kill any insects or fungi that might have taken up residence in the cork. It's not about softening, though it does make the cork more pliable and easier to work. It's about something deeper, something almost alchemical. The boiling cleans the cork of tannins and other compounds that would otherwise leach into anything it touches, and it expands the cells, opening up the tiny air pockets and making the cork more elastic, more compressible, more useful. The Romans knew this. The Greeks knew this. The prehistoric people who first used cork probably figured it out through trial and error, dropping pieces of bark into their cooking fires and noticing that the ones that got wet before they got hot behaved differently than the ones that stayed dry. The knowledge has been passed down through millennia, refined but never fundamentally changed, because some things work so well that there's no point in improving them. You move closer to one of the cauldrons, feeling the heat radiating from its sides, watching the steam rise and dissipate in the cool morning air. The water inside is dark, almost black, stained by the tannins leaching out of the cork. Every few minutes, a worker uses a long pole to stir the contents, ensuring that all the panels are evenly exposed to the heat and water. The cork floats, of course, it's one of its most useful properties, so they have to hold it down with weighted grates, forcing it to submit to the transformation it's undergoing. You watch a panel being lifted out after about an hour of boiling, and you're struck by how different it looks. The silvery grey of the weathered surface has become a rich, warm brown, and the texture has changed from rough and cracked to smooth and almost velvety. The cork has been reborn, awakened from its long sleep, made ready for whatever comes next. Historians still argue whether the boiling process was discovered accidentally or developed deliberately. The accidental theory is appealing. Someone drops a piece of cork into hot water, maybe while cooking, maybe while washing, and notices later that it's softer, cleaner, more useful. They tell their neighbors, who tell their neighbors, and soon everyone's boiling their cork before using it. The deliberate theory is more plausible to some researchers. Early cork users noticed that cork that got wet behaved differently, and they experimented with different ways of applying water and heat until they found the combination that worked best. Either way, the result is the same. A technology that has persisted for millennia because it works, because it transforms a useful material into an essential one, because it unlocks properties that would otherwise remain hidden. The boiled cork is stacked again, this time in a different pattern, with more space between panels to allow for complete drying. The water has expanded the cells, and as the cork dries, those cells will contract slightly, creating the compressibility that makes cork so valuable for sealing bottles. The tannins have been leached out, so the cork won't discolor anything it touches. Any remaining insects or eggs have been killed, so the cork won't harbor pests that might spread to other materials. The boiling has done its work, and now the cork just needs to rest, to dry, to become stable before it can be sorted and graded and sent to the factories where it will become 1,000 different things. You run your hand over a freshly boiled panel, feeling its warmth, its smoothness, its surprising softness. This piece of bark, this accumulation of dead cells and trapped air, has been transformed by fire and water into something new. It's still cork, still fundamentally the same material that grew on a tree in the Morna Dew, but it's been improved, refined, made ready for human use. The tree that produced it will never know what became of its armor, will never know that the cells it sacrificed for protection are now protecting wine or insulating buildings or cushioning footsteps. But you know, and you carry that knowledge with you as you walk away from the cauldrons, leaving the cork to its final drying, its final transformation, its final preparation for a life that has nothing to do with trees. The monastery sits on a hill overlooking the Morna Dew, its stone walls the color of aged cork, its windows dark against the afternoon sun. You've been walking for hours, following paths that Senhor Rui indicated with vague gestures and one-word directions, and now you've arrived at a place that feels like it belongs to a different world entirely. The cork forests stretch behind you, rolling across hills and valleys in patterns that look almost planned, almost designed, as if someone long ago decided exactly where each tree should go. Ahead of you, the monastery rises like a natural outcropping, like something that grew here rather than something that was built. You push open the heavy wooden door, banded with iron, hinged on massive straps, clearly centuries old, and step inside. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the absence of sound, exactly, but the absorption of it, The way the air seems to drink up every noise before it can travel more than a few feet. Your footsteps, which should echo on stone, make only a soft thudding that dies almost instantly. The door, which should boom shut behind you, closes with a whisper. You stand in the entryway, listening to nothing, and you realize that the silence itself is a kind of presence, a thing you can feel pressing against your ears. This is what Cork does. This is why monasteries have been using it for centuries, why monks have been walking on cork floors since long before anyone thought to put it in wine bottles. The floor beneath your feet is cork, tiles of it laid in a geometric pattern that repeats endlessly down the long corridor ahead. They're worn smooth in the center, where generations of monks have walked, but still textured at the edges, still showing the distinctive pattern of cork cells magnified to human scale. You kneel and touch one of the tiles, feeling its slight give, its warmth, its silence. This cork was harvested decades ago, maybe centuries, from trees that may still be standing in the morning dew. It was boiled and dried and pressed into tiles and laid here by craftsmen who understood that some materials are meant to be walked on, meant to absorb the sounds of human passage, meant to create spaces where silence can flourish. The monks who walk here daily, who have walked here for 800 years, have worn these tiles smooth with their sandals, their bare feet, their knees as they prayed. The floor remembers them, carries their imprint, holds their silence. You walk down the corridor, and with each step you understand more deeply why cork became the material of choice for places like this. It's not just the silence, though that's part of it. It's the warmth, the way cork holds the heat of the day and releases it slowly through the cold night. It's the resilience, the way it cushions each step and returns to its original shape, never wearing out no matter how many feet pass over it. It's the beauty, the subtle patterns and variations that make each tile unique while still fitting into the larger design. The monks who built this place knew what they were doing. They understood materials in a way that modern builders often forget, choosing not for cost or convenience but for the way things feel, the way they age, the way they become part of a place over centuries. The monastery opens into a courtyard, and here the cork gives way to stone, to open sky, to the sounds of birds and wind that were muffled inside. You stand in the center, looking up at the surrounding walls, at the windows that open into cells where monks have lived and prayed and died for 8 centuries. Some of those cells have cork floors too, you've been told, and cork-lined walls, and cork ceilings. Whole rooms lined with the stuff, creating spaces of profound silence where monks could retreat from the world and listen for the voice of God. You try to imagine what that would be like, to live in a room where every sound is absorbed, where your own breathing is the loudest thing you hear, where the world outside might as well not exist. It sounds like heaven, or like hell, depending on what you're running from. Historians still argue whether monasteries played a role in preserving cork harvesting traditions during periods of political and social upheaval. The theory makes sense. Monasteries were stable institutions in unstable times, with long-term perspectives that matched the slow growth of cork oaks. Monks planted trees they would never harvest, built floors that would outlast them, made decisions based on centuries rather than seasons. They had the resources, the land, the labor, and the patience to maintain traditions that might otherwise have been lost. And they had the records, carefully kept ledgers noting which trees were planted when, which were harvested, which produced the best cork. Some of those records still exist, stored in monastery archives, waiting for researchers to come along and piece together the history of a relationship that has lasted longer than any human institution. You wander through the monastery for hours, losing track of time in the silence of cork-lined corridors. You find the library, where books rest on cork-lined shelves that protect them from damp and insects. You find the chapel, where cork kneelers cushion the prayers of the faithful. You find the dormitory, where monks sleep on cork mattresses that have supported generations of bodies. Everywhere you go, cork is present, not as a decoration or a luxury but as a necessity, a fundamental part of how this place works. The monks didn't choose cork because it was fashionable or expensive. They chose it because it worked, because it did what they needed it to do, because it would last as long as they needed it to last. And it has. 800 years later, the cork is still here, still silent, still doing its job. As the sun begins to set, you make your way back to the entrance, pausing at the door to look back down the long corridor. The cork floor stretches away from you, worn smooth by centuries of feet, lit by the golden light that pours through western windows. You'll leave soon, return to the Morna Dew, to the trees, to the work that brought you here. But you'll carry this place with you, this silence, this sense of time stretched so thin that centuries feel like moments. And when you next walk through the cork forest, when you next place your hand on a tree that has been harvested for decades, you'll remember the monastery and the monks and the floors that have been absorbing footsteps since before your country existed. The cork connects them, the trees and the monastery, the harvest and the silence, the past and the present. And you're part of that connection now, whether you wanted to be or not. You've probably never thought about how the wine in your glass got there. You've probably never wondered what keeps it from turning into vinegar, what seals the bottle against the air that would spoil it, what material has been trusted for centuries to protect some of the most expensive liquids on Earth. The answer is cork, of course, has always been cork, will probably always be cork, despite the best efforts of plastic and aluminum to replace it. And the reason is sitting in stacks throughout the Morna Dew, drying in the sun, waiting to become the stoppers that will seal bottles you'll never open, protecting wines you'll never taste, for drinkers who will never know your name. The connection between cork and wine is so obvious that it's easy to overlook, so fundamental that it seems like it must have always existed. But it didn't. For most of human history, wine was stored in amphorae sealed with clay or wax or oil-soaked rags, and it spoiled regularly, and people drank it anyway because they didn't know any better. The Romans used cork for some wine containers, but not consistently. It was expensive, hard to get, and not obviously better than the alternatives. It took centuries for the relationship to develop, for winemakers to realize that cork wasn't just another stopper but something special, something that actively improved the wine it protected. The breakthrough came in the 17th century, when glass bottles became strong enough to hold fermented beverages without exploding. Suddenly, wine could be aged, could be stored for years instead of months, could develop the complex flavors that connoisseurs now take for granted. But aging required a seal that would keep air out while allowing tiny amounts of oxygen to interact with the wine. A seal that would expand and contract with temperature changes, that wouldn't react chemically with the wine, that would last for decades without degrading. Cork was the only material that could do all those things. It still is, really, despite decades of research into alternatives. The same properties that make cork useful for flooring and insulation make it essential for wine. Compressibility, impermeability, chemical inertness, longevity. The cork oak spent millions of years evolving these traits to protect itself from fire. Humans spent a few centuries figuring out how to use them to protect wine. You pick up a piece of cork from a nearby stack and examine it with new eyes, seeing not just bark but potential. The potential to become 1,000 stoppers, to seal 1,000 bottles, to protect 1,000 wines through years of aging. This piece came from a tree that may have been harvested dozens of times, that may have produced cork for centuries, that may have contributed to wines drunk by kings and peasants and everyone in between. It's impossible to trace, impossible to know, but the possibility is there, embedded in the cells like the air they contain. Somewhere in the world, right now, someone is opening a bottle sealed with cork from this forest, from a tree like the ones you've been harvesting, from a harvest like the one you're learning. They'll never know it, never think about it, never wonder where that cork came from or who put it there. But you'll know, and that knowledge changes everything. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of cork for wine stoppers was inevitable or accidental. The inevitability camp points to cork's unique properties. Nothing else works as well, so of course it became the standard once the technology existed to use it. The accident camp notes that other materials were tried, other methods developed, and Cork only won out through a combination of historical contingencies. The rise of the Portuguese cork industry, the decline of alternative stoppers, the preferences of influential winemakers. Both sides have evidence. Both sides have arguments. And both sides miss the point, which is that cork and wine were made for each other, whether by evolution or by chance or by something in between. The relationship works because it has to work, because wine needs cork and cork needs wine, and together they've created something neither could achieve alone. The journey from tree to bottle is long and strange, full of transformations that would be invisible to anyone who hasn't spent time in the Morna Dhu. After the cork is harvested, stacked, boiled, and dried, it goes to factories where it's sorted by quality and thickness. The best cork, thickest, most uniform, least flawed, is punched into stoppers, one at a time, by machines that have replaced the hand cutters who once did this work. The stoppers are washed, bleached, sorted again, stamped with the names of wineries or regions or years. They're packaged and shipped to wineries around the world, where they're inserted into bottles filled with wine that may have been aged for years in oak barrels. And then they wait, sometimes for decades, in cellars and caves and temperature-controlled rooms, until someone opens the bottle and the cork performs its final function, coming out cleanly, intact, having done its job perfectly for however long it was needed. You'll never see that part of the process. You'll never know which bottles end up with cork from trees you harvested, which wines are protected by your work, which drinkers benefit from your labor. The cork leaves the Morna Dhu and enters a global economy, losing its connection to the trees that produced it, becoming just another commodity in a world full of commodities. But you'll know, and that knowledge will stay with you every time you open a bottle of wine, every time you see a cork bulletin board, every time you walk on a cork floor. You'll remember the trees, the harvest, the stacking, the boiling. You'll remember the weight of the panels and the sound of the stripping and the feel of the naked trunk beneath your hand. And you'll know that you were part of something ancient and ongoing, something that connects you to people you'll never meet and times you'll never see. The cork forest has secrets. You've known this since your first day in the Morna Dhu, since you felt the weight of centuries pressing down on you, since you heard the trees whispering in a language you couldn't quite understand. But you're only now beginning to learn what those secrets are, only now hearing the stories that the oaks have been keeping for generations. Senhor Rui tells you some of them, in his broken Portuguese and elaborate gestures, as you work side by side in the afternoon sun. Others you discover for yourself, stumbling upon them as you move through the forest, as you rest beneath ancient trees, as you let the silence of the Morna Dhu seep into your bones. The smuggling started centuries ago, during the Inquisition, when Portugal was a dangerous place for anyone whose beliefs didn't match the official line. Jews, Muslims, heretics of all kinds, they fled into the countryside, looking for places to hide, for communities that would shelter them, for paths to freedom that bypassed the authorities. And they found the cork forests. The Morna Dhu became a refuge, a hidden world within a world, where people could disappear among the trees and never be found. The cork oaks didn't judge, didn't inform, didn't care what you believed or where you came from. They just stood there, offering their shade and their silence, letting you hide in their shadows until it was safe to move on. You walk through the forest now, seeing it with new eyes, noticing the hollows where people might have slept, the clearings where they might have gathered, the paths that lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The trees themselves bear witness, carved with symbols that might be messages, marked with signs that might be warnings, shaped by hands that were desperate and afraid. You find a tree with a hollow base, big enough for a person to curl up inside, and you wonder how many people hid there, how many hearts pounded in terror as footsteps approached, how many lives were saved by a hole in a cork oak. The tree doesn't say. It just stands there, silent as always, keeping its secrets. The smuggling wasn't just about people. It was about goods too, contraband that could be hidden in the forest, moved along secret paths, traded in the dead of night. Cork itself became a cover, a legitimate product that could be used to mask illegitimate activities. A load of cork panels might contain hidden compartments, false bottoms, spaces where smuggled goods could travel unnoticed. A cork forest might contain hidden caches, buried treasures, stores of wealth that couldn't be kept anywhere else. The authorities knew, or suspected, but they couldn't search every load, patrol every path, question every harvester. The forest was too big, too wild, too full of places where secrets could hide. Historians still argue whether the cork forests were systematically used for smuggling or just occasionally convenient. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered, hard to interpret. A few documents survive: court records, customs reports, letters mentioning suspicious activities, but they're rare, and they don't tell a complete story. The oral traditions are stronger, passed down through generations of families who lived in and around the Morna, but oral traditions are notoriously unreliable, changing with each telling, adapting to each audience. Some researchers think the smuggling was widespread, an organized network that moved people and goods across borders and around authorities. Others think it was mostly legend, a few isolated incidents blown out of proportion by people who wanted to believe in romantic outlaws and hidden treasures. The truth, as usual, is probably somewhere in between. You press your ear against the trunk of an ancient oak, the way Senhor Rui showed you, and you listen. The tree is warm against your skin, slightly rough, slightly giving. At first you hear nothing but the wind in the branches, the distant call of a bird, the thumping of your own heart. But then, gradually, you hear something else, a whispering, a murmuring, a sound that might be the tree itself or might be your imagination or might be something in between. The Descorticadores say that the trees remember, that they hold the stories of everyone who ever sheltered beneath them, that if you listen long enough and carefully enough, you can hear those stories echoing in the grain. You don't know if you believe it, but you listen anyway, because listening costs nothing and because the forest has earned the right to your attention. The whispering grows louder, or seems to, resolving into something almost like words, almost like voices, almost like the distant murmur of conversation. You hear Portuguese, maybe, and Hebrew, and Arabic, and languages you don't recognize. You hear prayers and curses and lullabies and last words. You hear the sounds of people hiding, waiting, hoping, fearing. And then, as suddenly as it started, the whispering fades, and you're left with nothing but the wind and the bird and your own heartbeat. You step back from the tree, slightly dizzy, slightly disoriented, not sure what just happened. Senhor Rui, watching from a few meters away, nods slowly and turns back to his work. He's heard it too, many times. He knows what the trees can do when you listen. The smuggling ended, mostly, as the Inquisition faded and Portugal became a different kind of place. But the secrets remain, hidden in the forest, waiting for anyone patient enough to find them. The hollow trees still stand, though the people who hid in them are long dead. The hidden caches still exist, though their contents have been removed or rotted or forgotten. The paths still wind through the Morna, though they lead nowhere now, going about their business of connecting trees to trees and clearings to clearings. And the whispering continues, if you know how to listen, if you have the patience to press your ear against the bark and wait for the forest to speak. The cork oaks keep their secrets well, but they share them too, with those who take the time to ask. The day is ending, and you're tired in a way that has nothing to do with the work. You've harvested trees, stacked cork, visited monasteries, listened to secrets. You've learned more than you thought possible about a material you never thought about at all. And now, as the sun sinks toward the horizon and the Morna settles into evening, you find yourself drawn to one last tree, not to work, not to learn, but simply to be. Senhor Rui has gone home, back to his family and his dinner and his evening routine. The other harvesters have left too, their tools stowed, their work done for the day. You're alone in the forest, surrounded by cork oaks that have been here for centuries and will be here for centuries more, and you feel something you can't quite name settling over you like a blanket. You find a tree that calls to you for no reason you can articulate. Not the oldest, not the largest, not the most impressive by any external measure. It's just a tree, like all the others, with its gnarled trunk and its spreading branches and its thick coat of cork waiting to be harvested in some future year. But something about it feels right, feels like home, feels like the place you're supposed to be. You walk up to it slowly, the way you approached your first tree this morning, and you place your hand on its bark. The cork gives slightly under your palm, the way it always does, and you feel the warmth that the tree has stored through the long afternoon. This tree has been here for 100 years, maybe 200, maybe more. It has been harvested dozens of times, each harvest leaving its mark on the trunk, each mark telling a story that only the tree remembers. And now you're here, adding your own chapter to that story, becoming part of something that will continue long after you're gone. You sit down at the base of the tree, leaning back against its trunk, feeling its solidity and its patience and its complete indifference to your presence. The tree doesn't care that you're here. It doesn't care about your thoughts or your feelings or your attempts to find meaning in this experience. It just stands there, doing what trees do, growing and shedding and waiting and surviving. And somehow that indifference is comforting, is freeing, is exactly what you need right now. The tree doesn't judge you. It doesn't expect anything from you. It doesn't need you to be anything other than what you are, right now, in this moment. You can just be here, leaning against its trunk, watching the light fade, feeling the day's work settle into your muscles and your memory. The morning dew around you is quieting down, the birds finding their roosts, the insects beginning their evening songs, the small creatures of the forest emerging from their daytime hiding places. You hear rustlings in the undergrowth, see shadows moving at the edge of your vision, sense the presence of life all around you. The forest is waking up as the day ends, shifting from one mode of being to another, and you're here to witness it, to be part of it, to let it wash over you. This is what the descorticadors know, what they carry with them through all their years of work. The forest is alive in ways that have nothing to do with humans, and the greatest gift it offers is the chance to be present in that aliveness, to feel it without trying to control or understand or use it. You close your eyes and listen. The wind moves through the branches, making a sound like distant water. The cork creaks slightly as the tree adjusts to the cooling temperature. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls, beginning its nightly hunt. And beneath all of these sounds, you hear something else. The silence that cork makes possible, the absence of echo and reflection, the way the forest absorbs sound, the way it absorbs light. You're sitting in one of the quietest places on earth, surrounded by trees that have spent millions of years learning to be silent, and you feel that silence seeping into you, filling the spaces that were previously filled with noise and worry and the constant chatter of your own mind. It's peaceful here. It's safe here. It's exactly where you're supposed to be. Historians still argue whether the cork forests will survive the coming centuries, given the pressures of climate change and economic transformation. The question is urgent, and the answers are uncertain. Cork oaks are adapted to a specific range of temperatures and rainfall patterns, and as those patterns shift, the trees may struggle to adapt. The demand for cork is changing too, with synthetic alternatives competing for market share and wine drinkers increasingly turning to screw caps and plastic stoppers. The ancient relationship between humans and cork oaks may be entering its final chapter, or it may be evolving into something new, something we can't yet imagine. Either way, the trees will keep growing, keep producing, keep doing what they've always done, until they can't anymore. And then they'll stop, and something else will take their place, and the world will keep turning, and the silence will remain. But that's for the future to worry about. Right now, in this moment, you're here, leaning against a cork oak in the Portuguese morning, watching the stars emerge one by one as the sky darkens. The tree beneath you is warm and solid and utterly indifferent to your presence, and that indifference is the greatest gift it could give. You don't have to be anything special here. You don't have to achieve anything or prove anything or become anything. You just have to be present, to breathe, to feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on you and lifting you up at the same time. The cork oak has been doing this for longer than humans have existed, and it will keep doing it long after we're gone. And for now, for this moment, you get to be part of it. You get to rest in its shadow and listen to its silence and feel its ancient patience seeping into your bones. You get to sleep, finally, in the arms of the morning dew. The wind picks up slightly, moving through the cork with a sound like breathing, like whispering, like the tree itself is settling down for the night. You feel your eyes growing heavy, your body relaxing against the trunk, your mind letting go of the day's thoughts and worries and questions. Tomorrow there will be more work, more trees, more learning. But tonight there is only this, the tree, the silence, the stars, and you. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. The wind moves through the cork oaks one last time, a soft rustling that sounds almost like words, almost like a blessing, almost like the forest itself is saying goodbye. You've been here for what feels like both a day and a lifetime, have learned things you didn't know you needed to know, have touched trees that will outlive you and your children and your children's children. The morning dew has done what it always does. It has taken a stranger and made them part of its story, woven them into the fabric of bark and root and silence that stretches back centuries and will stretch forward for centuries more. You rise slowly from the base of the tree, your body stiff from sitting so long, your mind still drifting in that space between waking and sleeping. The stars are fully out now, spread across the sky in patterns that shepherds and harvesters have been reading for millennia, using them to mark the seasons, to time the harvests, to navigate the long nights between one day and the next. You can see the Milky Way stretching from horizon to horizon, a river of light that the ancient Portuguese call the Caminho de Santiago, the road of St. James, believing it marked the path that souls took to reach the afterlife. It's as good a story as any, you think, and better than most. The souls of all those who have worked these forests, who have harvested these trees, who have loved this land. They're up there somewhere, walking that road, looking down on the morning dew they left behind. You take one last look at the tree that sheltered you, running your hand over its bark one final time. The cork gives slightly, the way it always does, and you feel that familiar warmth, that sense of connection to something larger than yourself. This tree has been harvested dozens of times, will be harvested dozens more, will keep producing long after you're gone and forgotten. The mark you carved this morning, that single-digit 5, will fade over the years, grown over by new cork, hidden beneath layers of future harvests. But it will always be there, somewhere beneath the surface, a reminder that you existed, that you were here, that you did this work. The tree will carry you forward, the way it carries all the others, adding your presence to its rings and its records and its silent memory. The walk back to the edge of the forest is longer than you remember, or maybe shorter. Time moves strangely here, stretching and compressing in ways that defy measurement. The path winds between trees that seem to glow in the starlight, their cork trunks silvered by the moon, their branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in blessing or supplication. You pass the clearing where you stacked your cork, the stacks now just dark shapes in the night, waiting for morning and the next stage of their journey. You pass the spot where you made your first cut, the tree still standing there, naked and vulnerable and already beginning the slow process of growing new armor. You pass all the places that have become familiar over these long hours, and each one feels like a farewell, like a door closing behind you as you walk toward whatever comes next. At the edge of the forest, you stop and turn back. The morning dew stretches behind you, dark and silent and full of secrets, full of trees that have been here for centuries and will be here for centuries more. Somewhere out there, Senhor Rui is sleeping, his dreams filled with cork and axes and the faces of trees he's known his whole life. Somewhere out there, the descorticadors are resting, gathering strength for another day of work, another season of harvest, another cycle in the endless relationship between humans and cork oaks. And somewhere out there, the trees themselves are doing what they always do, growing, waiting, being trees, indifferent to the humans who come and go around them like mayflies around a flame. You turn away from the forest and walk toward whatever life awaits you beyond its borders. You'll carry the morna dew with you, of course, in your hands, which remember the weight of cork panels, in your ears, which remember the sound of stripping, in your heart, which remembers the feeling of leaning against an ancient oak and watching the stars appear. You'll never look at a wine bottle the same way again, never walk on a cork floor without thinking of the trees that produced it, never hear the word Portugal without seeing in your mind's eye the rolling hills of the morna dew, the gnarled trunks of the cork oaks, the patient faces of the descorticadors who tend them. You've been changed by this place, by this work, by this quiet process that has been unfolding here since before anyone thought to write it down. And now it's time to rest. Time to let the day's experiences settle into memory, to let the silence of the forest become part of your inner landscape, to let the slow rhythm of the cork oaks teach you something about patience and presence and the value of simply being alive. The morna dew will be here when you wake, will be here when you return, will be here long after you're gone. That's the gift it offers, the only gift it can offer. The knowledge that some things endure, that some relationships outlast us, that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives. The cork oaks know this. The descorticadors know this. And now, after this long day, after this journey through time and silence and bark and memory, you know it too. So rest now, here at the edge of the forest, with the stars above and the trees behind and the long road ahead. Rest in the knowledge that you've done something real today, something that connects you to centuries of human experience and millennia of natural history. Rest in the silence that cork makes possible, the silence that has been growing here since the first oak sprouted from the first acorn, the silence that will continue long after the last harvest is done. Rest, and let the morna dew hold you one last time, cradling you in its ancient patience, wrapping you in its quiet warmth, singing you to sleep with the whisper of wind through cork and the distant call of owls and the soft, steady breathing of trees that have been waiting for you since before you were born. Sleep well. The cork oaks will keep watch.